Now, one of the questions that I see asked all the time is, should I buy a full frame or a crop sensor aps-c camera? And if you're looking to make your first camera purchase or update your existing camera body, then no doubt, that's a very important question. Now, if you're confused by terms such as crop factor, depth of field, dynamic range, and all that other fancy sounding camera jargon, then don't worry, because I'm going to explain all of that to you in the most simple and easy to understand terms. And by the end of the video, you should know exactly if a full frame camera is better for you or if you should go with a crop sensor camera instead. So when you hear the phrase full frame, this is referring to the sensor of the camera, and more specifically, the size of the sensor. A crop sensor just means that the size of the sensor is physically smaller than a full frame sensor. And crop sensor cameras are divided into two main categories. The more common one being referred to as aps-c, and the less common one is called micro four thirds, also known as MFT, which stands for, yep, you guessed it, micro four thirds. So an aps-c sensor is smaller than a full frame sensor, and a micro four thirds sensor is even smaller than the aps-c sensor. And bigger is always better, right? Well, not exactly. So don't automatically assume that a full frame camera is the best choice for you, because depending on your use case, you might be better off with an aps-c camera or even a micro four thirds. Let me explain. You see, there's 4 characteristics of photos and videos that are going to be affected by the size of the sensor in the camera. And the first one we're going to discuss is called crop factor. A full frame sensor is going to have a crop factor of 0 because it's full frame. An aps-c sensor is going to have a crop factor of 1.5x. And in the case of Canon, it's 1.6x. And a micro four thirds sensor is going to have a crop factor of 2x. And all that means is that the photos and videos coming out of an aps-c camera are going to be 1.5 times zoomed in compared to the image and videos coming out of a full frame camera. And the image and videos coming out of a micro four thirds camera are going to be zoomed in 2 times when compared to the images coming out of a full frame camera. Now that zoom, which is more properly referred to as a crop, can make your life more difficult as a photographer or videographer, or it can make your life easier. So let's say that the main thing that you do is vlogging. Well, if you put a 16mm lens on a full frame camera, you can hold the camera 1 foot away from you like I'm doing right now, and you'll be able to get a similar shot to what you're seeing on the screen right now, where you're seeing a lot of the background, my face, and a portion of my body. Now, if you were to put that same 16mm lens on the aps-c camera, you'd have to literally hold that camera probably around maybe 4 feet away from you to be able to get a similar frame to what you're seeing now. And that would make vlogging extremely difficult, because if I were to hold that aps-c camera a foot away from me, then all you'd be able to see is my pores, which is no bueno. And that's why full frame cameras are the best choice for people who do vlogging, real estate, or wide landscape shots. Now, on the other hand, let's imagine that you were a wildlife photographer and you work for the BBC or something like that, and you had an assignment to go and do like a nature documentary, right? And you had to get a whole bunch of photos and videos of the almost extinct wild African man-eating polar bear. Do you really want to be all in his face, shoving a camera all up in his snout, trying to get photos of him? Not me. I'm bringing my aps-c camera, or better yet, my micro four thirds camera on that trip. That way I can keep my distance and get that same shot from far away. Now, all jokes aside, the example of the vlogger and the wildlife photographer are 2 common references used to illustrate this point. But there's a whole lot of scenarios like it. For example, if you do a lot of real estate interiors or exteriors and you want to be able to stand in the corner of a room and easily be able to fit the whole room within the frame, making the footage and the photos of the room look nice and large, then you're better off with a full frame camera. Whereas if you shoot sports events where you can't get that close, or you do birding or things of that nature, then you probably want to go with the aps-c or a micro four thirds, as you could benefit from the extra reach. So that's crop factor. Now, before we move on to the second characteristic that's affected by your camera's sensor size, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I appreciate that. So the next characteristic is called depth of field. And oftentimes, you'll hear people talking about shallow depth of field. And what that means is that when your subject is in focus, the background is all nice and blurry looking. That's shallow depth of field. It's also referred to as bokeh. And the closer that your camera is to the subject, the easier it is to get that sought after blurry background. And that's another big reason why many people prefer full frame cameras over crop sensor cameras. Now don't get me wrong, it's not that you can't get bokeh with crop sensor cameras. You most definitely can, but you're gonna have to get lenses with a much wider aperture than you would on a full frame camera. So let's say you're shooting on a full frame camera with an f2.8 aperture lens. The bokeh that's going to give you is going to be the same as an aps-c camera that's shooting with an f1.8 aperture lens. So as you can see, you need a faster aperture on aps-c to be able to get the same amount of bokeh. And on a micro four thirds sensor, you would need a lens with an even wider aperture than that. So to avoid having to give too technical of an explanation, we can generalize and say that you're going to get better bokeh on a full frame camera. So that's pretty simple stuff so far, right? And there's only two characteristics left to discuss. And by the time that we knock out the remaining two, if it's too much for you to digest, then don't worry. Because to make things easier, I'm going to give you some camera recommendations in all three categories: full frame, aps-c, and micro four thirds. That way you'll know which sensor size best suits you and your style of videography or photography, and which are the best camera options within that category. So moving along, the third image characteristic that's affected by your camera sensor size is how well your camera does in low light situations. And generally speaking, full frame cameras are gonna do the best in low light, and micro four thirds cameras are gonna do the worst. But take that with a grain of salt, because although that's the general rule, there's a whole lot of exceptions when it comes to low light. Because it's not just the sensor size that's gonna determine the low light performance. Your camera's processor also plays a big role. So it is safe to say that full frame cameras are gonna do the best in low light and high ISO situations. But it's not written in stone. And that brings us to the last characteristic that we need to discuss, which is dynamic range and overall image quality. So a camera with good dynamic range is going to be able to expose for your subject and at the same time be able to get all the details in the sky and the clouds and everything like that. Whereas if you have a camera where the dynamic range isn't so good, you're going to have to choose between either the sky or your subject. If you expose for the sky and you want the sky not to be blown out, then your subject is going to be too dark. And if you expose for your subject where your subject is nice and bright and visible, then the sky is going to be all white and blown out. So that's a simplified definition of dynamic range. And for the most part, it's the same story. Basically, full frame sensors are going to give you better dynamic range and better overall image quality. But out of all the characteristics that we discussed, I would say that this is the one that's least affected by your sensor size. And there's a whole bunch of exceptions in this category, as you have many cinema cameras that have aps-c sensors. And in the cinema world, aps-c is often referred to as Super 35. And those cameras have amazing dynamic range and overall image quality, many times better than many full frame cameras. Take for example the Ursa Mini 12K cinema camera. It has a micro four thirds sensor, but many cinematographers prefer the image coming out of that camera over many cinema cameras that have a full frame sensor like the Sony FX3. But nevertheless, the general rule is that full frame cameras are going to give you better dynamic range and better overall image quality. So let's move on to my camera recommendations. Now, if you're a vlogger, content creator here on YouTube or social media, real estate photographer or videographer, or someone that shoots wide landscapes or architecture, then by now you probably understand why a full frame camera is probably going to be your best bet. But if you're a filmmaker or cinematographer that doesn't vlog and doesn't need to get extremely wide shots, then it really comes down to your personal preference, because you could go with a full frame or a crop sensor camera. And if you need to go to Africa to shoot man-eating polar bears, or you do birding or sports photography, etc., then you could get an aps-c or micro four thirds thirds camera, which is not only better suited for that type of work, but generally speaking, crop sensor cameras are cheaper than full frame cameras, and the lenses are cheaper as well. So in the micro four thirds category, the camera that I would suggest is already a few years old, but it's still an amazing camera. It's called the Panasonic Lumix GH5. It has 10-bit color, a whole bunch of cinema camera features, and it has the best in-body image stabilization probably of all cameras out there. And for $1,300, I think it's still an amazing hybrid camera that's capable of giving you professional photos and videos. However, the main downside to that camera is that it doesn't really have reliable autofocus, so I stay away from it if you're not comfortable using strictly manual focus. In the aps-c category, there's 3 cameras that I really like. The first one is a budget offering from Nikon. It's called the Nikon Z30. It comes in at about $700 and it's probably the best entry-level camera that you could get at that price range. If you're looking for something more professional than that and have $1,500 to spend, then the Canon EOS R7 is going to give you amazing photos and videos, and in my opinion, it's probably the best aps-c hybrid camera available at that price range. Now, if you're not interested in photos at all, and all you want to do is filmmaking, then if you have $1,800 to spend, then Sony just came out with a camera called the FX30, which is an aps-c cinema camera, which has amazing autofocus, 10-bit color, and a whole bunch of other cool features. And I left links in the description below to all the cameras that I'm discussing in this video, as well as other gear that I found valuable and useful. And that brings us to the full frame category. Now, for most of you out there that are going to be using your camera to do content creation, and you're looking for a quality hybrid camera that's going to be able to give you professional level photos and videos, I think it's worth the extra investment to go with full frame from the start. That way you avoid the hassle of having to sell your aps-c camera and all your lenses later on if you ever decide that you want to switch to full frame. And by the way, most full frame cameras out there have an option where you can use it in aps-c mode, where it crops in on the sensor. That way you get the best of both worlds. So my first full frame recommendation, if you want to know more about this camera, then I really suggest that you watch this video right here, where I tell you exactly why I like this camera so much.